a very warm welcome to the 68th edition of Europe Calling, the webinar series with so far more than 50,000 interested, which brings Brussels politics closer to the citizens using, of course, the lovely internet we have all enjoyed during the last month. But actually, this series has started before Corona times. And this time I'm really privileged because we have special guests. First, Harald Schumann of the European Group of Investigative Journalists, Investigate EU, and Vicky Cann of Corporate Europe Observatory. But before we start, please get yourself a bit accustomed with the system. So through the chat, there should be now very soon a link to the German translation. Exactly, the German translation. So, of course, it's absurd to make an announcement about translation into German in English. So therefore, everybody who understands English properly will have to stand some German now. So, herzlich willkommen zu dieser 68. Folge von Europe Calling. Wir haben hier großartige Gäste, alle, die mit dem Englischen ein bisschen Schwierigkeiten haben, gerade wenn es um Brüsseler Chinesisch geht und Institutionen, dann gerne auf diesen Link unter Chat gehen und dort erscheint dann eine schriftliche Übersetzung. Wir sind nicht bescheuert, wir blenden das alle paar Minuten neu ein, aber wenn Leute sich neu dazu wählen, können die den alten Chat leider nicht lesen, so ist die Technik. So, und insofern können wir jetzt auch gleich anfangen und ich rede weiter auf das, was ich für Englisch halte. So, let's continue and we have the first publication of the journalist consortium Investigate Europe on the transparency or rather non-transparency of the Council. This is an issue which is very close to my political heart because obviously in the European Parliament we are quite different. When we negotiate legislation, we are putting our amendments in the open. When we decide on our positions, so after compromise building, we are voting on those issues where we have differences and everybody can report about these differences. Obviously, this doesn't mean that every chat in a coffee or even in a meeting room is recorded word by word and that there's always a camera, but the key steps are fully transparent. And we do this because we are bound by the same treaty as the European Council and the European Commission. Unfortunately, the Council still feels that that the European Union is still an intergovernmental body of secret negotiations between sovereign member states, while we have, Harald, sorry, the typing is very loud. Sorry about this. So while the reality in Europe has already moved on much further. So we are a democracy of our own type, but unfortunately, one part of the decision-making bodies is refusing transparency. I have only to say that for a German, this is not fully surprising because what we are seeing in the Council is just how the German second chamber, the Bundesrat, operates. Also there, key decision-making moments are not recorded, not public, and therefore, but of course, we are taking here decisions not for one country, but for a whole community of countries. And as the European Ombudswoman O'Reilly has pointed out, there is a question of accountability. And therefore, I'm very curious to hear, first of all, from the journalists, what they found out, whether the Council was more transparent to the journalists than they are to us as a European Parliament. And I'm also curious what Vicky can report about transparency of the EU, because she has been involved in many fights over access to documents and access to information from the Council. So you can certainly tell us, as a practitioner of transparency, how far you got. So, but journalists first, I'm very honored that Harald Schumann does the launch of what has started with a series of articles yesterday in the Tagesspiegel, a Berlin daily. And I'm now looking forward to hearing about the results of your European consortium, which I, by the way, can only recommend. So please, Harald, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much, Sven, for inviting me and talk about this issue. Well, to begin with, I do reporting about European affairs since 30 years or so. But when I now dealt in depth with how the Council, as one of the two decisive legislative bodies in the European Union, how they actually work, I have to admit, I came across a lot of things I would have never expected. Really, even me, I was surprised. Yeah, and I running the risk that maybe half of you who are in the audience now is bored by this, but my experience is that most of our fellow citizens and even most political journalists have no real practical idea how the European legislation actually works. So please excuse me that I start with a simple picture about European legislation, just that there is no misunderstanding which institution we talk about. So I just share here this simple picture. I hope you can see it. This is a general graph how legislation is done, and there you can see the European Commission usually is responsible to take the initiative for a law proposal, and they do this major work. And then there are two legislators, the European Parliament and the Council of the EU, who in most cases need to agree both to consensus on this law proposal. This is more or less known. And what the European Parliament does is also very known, and it's public and it's transparent, and the meeting of the committees are streamed and so on. But what the Council of the EU is, and what the European Council is, many people unfortunately do not know. And what we do see on TV is usually the European Council, when the heads of state or government meet to discuss general, you may say, outline of European policy, but they do not take legislative decisions. This is done in the Council of the European Union, sometimes also called Council of the Ministers. And this Council of the Ministers is not only when the ministers meet, yeah, you know, when we see this kind of picture, yeah, in this building here, but what it actually is, it's a very, very complex apparatus of more than 150 committees and working parties and subgroups. They have around 4,000 meetings per year in these buildings here. And most of what happens in these committees is kept secret, in spite of being actually journalistic, legislative work. And this is so important, because when you do not know what the legislators do, it's impossible to put critical questions. It's impossible to follow what actually happens with the law proposal which has come from the Commission, what happens to this law proposal in the Council. What they do is they do legislation as if they would negotiate international treaties. Yeah, they negotiate in camera and without informing the public how the results come about. Only the final result is made public. And that means legislation by diplomatic means, secret, no minutes, with national positions not publicly available. And this has profound consequences. As the mentioned ombudsman already said, it's virtually impossible for citizens to find out how a European law came into being. And this undermines the right of the citizens to hold their elected representatives to account. And it aims directly at the heart of EU's legitimacy. And this makes it so problematic. during our research, we found out that there are happening many things in the council which those responsible would never do if they would be forced to justify for this in the public. One striking example is the 2 years long negotiation about the rule of law mechanism. You know, everybody who is interested in EU affairs knows that currently we are in this situation where the Polish and the Hungarian government tries to blackmail the rest of the EU. Either you skip this rule of law mechanism, meaning you must not make the funding from European funds dependent on a check whether basic rule of law rules are followed in the countries. And they say either you do that or we veto the whole budget and the enormously important recovery fund. This is currently the situation. What most people do not know is this rule of law mechanism has been proposed by the Commission already 2 years ago. And the Council negotiated 2 years on this rule of law mechanism without coming to a result. And why did it take so long to find out that they have to decide it by a qualified majority against the will of some countries? It was so difficult because some countries sided with the Polish and the Hungarians. For example, the Portuguese government sided with them for a certain period of time. And the Italian government also cooperated with Mr. Orban, Mr. Kaczynski, and so on. And this made the negotiations in the council extremely complex and complicated. And from the very beginning, everybody agreed to mix the negotiation about the rule of law mechanism with the negotiation about the general budget, which also was not foreseen by the Commission. It was done in the council, yeah, to make it all dependent on each other. And if it would have been public already 2 years ago, what are the front lines in the council and why it takes so long? And if we would have a transnational cross-border European public discourse, I'm relatively sure the result would have been different. Another interesting example, and this has also to do with the internal rules, how the council negotiates about law, is they don't have a proper time limit up until when they have to decide on proposals from the Commission. So it might happen that when the council doesn't come to a consensus, that they postpone and postpone and postpone the decision indefinitely. And we came across one proposal which is actually already 8 years old. 8 years ago, the Commission has proposed to introduce a women's quota on non-executive seats on the board of publicly traded companies, on stock exchange companies. You know, from a current point of view, it's an old idea, yeah, 8 years ago. But the council refused to decide on this because there were some conservative governments who were against, yeah, the usual suspects, Poland, Hungary, some other Eastern Europeans, and so on. But suddenly, nobody really knew, and there was no public discourse about that there were also other countries who opposed it, and these were Denmark, Sweden, the Germans, the Dutch. Why did they do it? Officially, they oppose this women's quota because they say it's not the EU's business. We should take another legal basis. But I was explained by those who were near to this, the main reason why they went again together with Poland and Hungary and on this, because they did not want to decide this question in conflict and by majority voting. They wanted to decide it in a diplomatic consensus. The diplomatic consensus had not been reached. So up until today, there is a blocking minority. And this is another very special thing of how the legislation in the council works. And this is very different to the German Bundesrat, by the way, Sven. Because in the German Bundesrat also there is a simple majority principle. Yeah, 51% is sufficiently when it is not a constitutional question. But in the council, you need a 2/3 majority and a double qualified majority. You do not only need for supporting a proposal 65% of the population, you also need 15 countries. This is a good thing on the one hand, because it protects the small countries against the superpower of the big ones. But on the other hand, it means that you need only a relatively small minority to block or water down any kind of law proposal if you don't like it. And this, of course, is an enormous, powerful instrument for transnationally organized lobby organizations when they want to get rid of proposals they don't like. And one very typical example, you may say, is the proposal of the Commission presented 4 years ago, 2016, to force transnational corporations to public in their annual reports to the stockholders how many taxes they pay in which country and how much turnover and profit they make in these countries. So by this, it would make their tax avoidance practices transparent, and it would put pressure, public pressure on them to change these practices. And it is already proven that this works, because for banks, this rule is already in force. But for ordinary transnational corporations, it is not in force. But nobody ever heard of it. Why? You know, I'm relatively sure 90% of European voters would be in favor of this rule. Yeah, because tax avoidance by transnationals is really an annoying issue. We all pay taxes and they don't, or they pay much less. So why it has not come in force? And the reason is the German government defends the interest of the transnationals for reasons I put aside here. But the interesting thing is the German government found allies, and the allies were not known. Long, for many years, it was not known how the Germans managed to block this simple proposal by the Commission. And then it turned out, with the help of Sven last year, that the governments of the usual suspects, Luxembourg, Ireland, and so on, are on the side of the Germans, but also the socialists and social democrats from Sweden and Portugal. And by this, when you follow now the story, you can discover how dysfunctional this way of legislation with diplomatic means is, because it turned out when we reported in Portugal about the Portuguese position, it turned out that even the Portuguese government didn't really know what their diplomats were doing in Brussels. So there was a disconnect between the national government and capital and the Brussels representation. And after 3 days and a lot of protest in the parliament and by the governing parties, members of the parliament in Strasbourg and in Lisbon, 3 days later, the Portuguese government said, oh, we are in favor. Sorry for that, it was a misunderstanding. This as such, I think, is a scandal. It should not be possible that diplomats for representing a government in Brussels do something which the government itself does not know. Okay, you may say this is a Portuguese fault. But the interesting thing is that when you check country for country, you find out that in many other countries, even in Germany, from time to time, it happens that the Brussels diplomats do things in legislation which the responsible minister here in Berlin is not really informed about. It's overly complex, and because there is no public control, such things happen. And by this forming these blocking minorities, well organized by transnational lobbyists, they block a lot of laws. When I did the last check on the beginning of October, there were 30 law proposals from the Commission, which were stuck in the council, as the Brussels experts say. Meanwhile, there are a lot less because the European Commission has withdrawn 16 of them. But that means that a lot of legislative work is done. You know, the European Parliament usually takes a decision much earlier, and there is a lot of work invested, and public hearings, and many committees meeting, and negotiations, and amendments, and all this work is wasted because the Council refuses to take decisions. This is completely dysfunctional, and we should really go after it to stop this bad practice. And it's not only dysfunctional, it's also in a certain way non-democratic. Yeah? Just to remind you, Article 10 of the Lisbon Treaty says, every citizen shall have the right to participate in the democratic life of the Union. Decisions shall be taken as openly and as closely as possible to the citizen. This is a promise from the European Treaty, you may say the European Constitution, but it's permanently violated by the Council, and this is not only the private opinion of us journalists. We've talked to the former Advocate General of the European Court of Justice, Mr. Maduro, who has been part of several judgments done in this transparency issues and so on. And he frankly said, I think the current practice of secrecy in the European Council violates the case law of the European Court of Justice. This is a very strong allegation. And I think this alone is, you may say, a request to journalists and activists to go after this and keep digging and keep putting pressure on them that they stop this practice of secrecy, because it has nothing to do with basic norms of democratic transparency. Let me finish here for the first round, and maybe no.
Yes, thank you very much, Harald. I would only like you to perhaps enlighten us how the Council responded to your questioning, because that is perhaps interesting for everybody. And I would only like to say, please, if you have problems of listening, the quality of sound is very good. But if you have a problem, switch off the videos so that you can try to listen only. That is helpful if there is the usual underinvestment into digitalization in Germany in particular. Beyond that, please get prepared to ask questions. You can write your questions under F&A and mark the best questions up so that these are really dealt with. And Harald, could you please clarify the reaction of the Council? And then I give the floor to Vicky, of course.
Yeah, I just wanted to cut my presentation shorter, but this is why I skipped it. But when you think it's important, of course, I can add it. Actually, the press department of the Council has treated us the same way as the Council as such treats much more important people, like, for example, representatives of 20 national parliaments who are organized in an association called COSAC, or how they treated Mrs. O'Reilly, the European Ombudsman, who did an in-depth investigation in the Council's secrecy practices and so on. And we all have the same experience. This institution does not answer critical questions in public. You can have background talks with them, and they are very friendly officials who can explain everything to you. But when you ask them officially, how come that you do not answer the requests from 20 national parliaments to make national government positions regularly public at the beginning of the negotiations, why you didn't even answer this public letter? They even sent us a reply, we have got your questions and we try to answer in the deadline you have given us, and then nothing happened. We didn't get the questions back. Another question we have put is, according to several judgments by the European Court of Justice, the current practice of the Council breaks the case law of the ECJ. How come? How can you explain, elaborate? This was another question we have sent to them. Or we have asked them, how come that nearly half of all documents which the Council produces are regularly in a certain way classified? They are declared limit, which means that they must not be just made public on the website and so on, but you have to file a request for access on documents, and then maybe some of them are later made public and so on. how come that this is automatically done while the European treaties promise the opposite? Also, this question has not been answered, and so on and so on. So the problem, one major issue with the Council is that those responsible there, in a certain way, they seem to feel untouchable. Yeah, they do not follow ordinary rules of politeness. Yeah, they should have at least written, sorry, we can't make it to your deadline, we will answer you later, but not to answer at all. What is that?
Harald, okay, before you go totally nuts over this, I can only say this is everyday life for a parliamentarian. So, but however, now I would like to hand over to Vicky. First to say, please put down your questions in writing or open your, lift your hand so that we can have a few voices directly from the public. Please recognize this is being recorded so that also participants who couldn't make it can watch it. So please, if you use your name, be conscious that it will be recorded, and beyond that, if you belong to any institution, please note so that we practice what we preach, and that is transparency. Now, Vicky, I know you have been trying a lot to get documents and information from the Council. What is your experience over this, and how far did you get using also different forms of law enforcement? This question is also being asked. Can't we go to court? Please, Vicky.
Well, thank you very much. And a lot of what Harald has said feels very, very familiar to me, and I think my colleagues at Corporate Europe Observatory. We've had similar experiences of trying to expose particular lobby battles, trying to get documents out of the Council, and often being very thwarted when we want the minutes of meetings at these critical working parties. Thwarted because the minutes don't exist, because they're not taken. And even if minutes do exist, we don't get them because they reveal particular member states' positions, and that is seen as an absolute no-no by the Council. So I very much endorse what Harald is saying, and perhaps in the discussion we can bring out some more examples. But for now, perhaps I could also just step back a little bit and emphasize some key points, and maybe also extend the discussion a little bit. And the key point I would really like to make is my first point, and that's about how a lack of transparency at the Council really helps corporate lobbies to influence the Council and its member states. Now, Harald touched on that in his presentation, but I'd like to just spell that out a little bit more, because it might seem a little bit counterintuitive. How does a lack of transparency help corporate lobbies? How does that work? Well, let me explain. It's because if information is not automatically made available, you have to hunt for it. This takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of capacity and resources and people, it takes a lot of money. And that, as we know, is something where corporate lobbies have a massive inbuilt advantage over ordinary citizens, of course, but also over public interest NGOs and trade unions and others. Industry has the resources and the capacity to hire lobby firms to do some of this work for them. They have the capacity, the spending power to ring the 27 member states, to be able to map the different positions on any particular file, to run lobby campaigns, not just in Brussels, but in the 27 capitals. And crucially, corporate lobbies have the capacity, the power, the spending money, again, to stay in these issues for the long term. And as Harald said, these issues they often aren't decided quickly. Sometimes you have to track an issue for years and years. And again, that gives an advantage, if you like, to the corporate lobbies with this inbuilt capacity, these resources, this financial power to be able to stay in these lobby battles for the long term. and it disadvantages NGOs and trade unions, let alone citizens who just can't compete. And in our work, we have tried to map out how this works and how corporate lobbies are successful in influencing member states at the capitals at the national level, but also on their EU decision making. And the kind of examples that I'm talking about here are some of the really well-known ones, like how close the German government is to the car industry, for example, how close, when the UK was in the EU, how close the City of London was to the UK government, and how that influenced the UK's position at the EU level. We could talk about Poland and the coal industry. And what we know at the national level, that these industries and these governments are very closely intertwined, and somehow the national interest is co-opted, if you like, by the corporate interest in these particular sectors for these countries. We know it's happening, but actually at the council, because of the lack of transparency, it can be very hard to map the who, the what, the when, the how, the exact precise meetings in how this is happening. But there are also other perhaps less extreme examples of corporate capture, if you like, of decision making by member states at the EU level, but still very powerful ones. And in our work, we've looked at the relationship between France and the publishers on e-privacy. Harald has talked about in his work the power of German domestic lobbies in influencing German tax policy at the EU level. We've looked at Ireland and single-use plastics. However this corporate influence happens, we know that too many member states on too many issues have become captured states. They have allowed themselves to put forward corporate interests and not the public interest when they're looking at EU matters. We would even go as far as to say that in some examples, member states are acting as middlemen for corporate interests at the EU level. And so the lack of transparency that Harald has outlined not only prevents us from properly and fully exposing and challenging this corporate influence, it actually enables this corporate influence, if you like, because of the lack of resources and the disadvantage that it puts citizens and others. So transparency has to be a first step at the council level if we want to tackle and challenge this excessive corporate influence on EU policymaking. Transparency isn't enough. We would need other things in place as well, but it is a vital prerequisite. So it's really, I think, excellent that Investigate Europe and Transparency International and MEPs and others, the Ombudsman, are putting these issues on the agenda just as we are. But I have to say, I think there is still a long way to go in tackling these issues. Even the member states that are more progressive about opening up the council, and there is a group of 10 that traditionally have been more supportive of transparency and opening up decision making, even they are not at the moment interested in opening up at the working party level, where these secret negotiations that Harald outlined really happen. And when I look to the future of upcoming presidencies, I am also not filled with enthusiasm. We have Germany now, then it will be Portugal, it will be Slovenia, and then it will be France. And we know that Portugal and France are already in the camp of countries that are not supportive of opening up the council, and we know that Slovenia has a new right-wing government, so I'm not optimistic on that front. So there is a huge uphill battle, I think, for us to win at that EU level to open up the council. But there's one, I think, very important constituency that we must that we can take some encouragement from, and that is national MPs and parliaments. Now, not all parliaments have good rights to hold their governments to account for their EU decision making. But some do, particularly the Nordics, the Netherlands would be another one. And these parliamentarians have the right to not just hold their governments to account after a big event like the European Council summit or something like that, but they can actually have insight and oversight and sometimes influence on the positions that their government is taking at the council level. A good example is that in Denmark, parliamentarians have just passed a new resolution to strengthen its government's position on this corporate tax transparency file. That's great. Parliamentarians holding governments to account for the decisions that they will make at the EU level and having some influence over that. A lot of parliaments around Europe don't have these rights, but I think there is a movement of change, as Harald mentioned, this COSAC body, which coincidentally is meeting remotely today in Berlin. I think there are parliamentarians who are increasingly aware of this issue and how actually the lack of transparency at the council level, as well as by their own member states, is hindering their ability to do their own job. And there are a growing number of MPs at the national level that are taking action on this issue. And actually, even though the picture at the EU level may be difficult and disappointing, I take a lot of hope from the way that parliamentarians increasingly are trying to grab this agenda on behalf of citizens. So I'm going to wind up now, but I just want to reinforce my points. If we need to open up the council, and member state MPs really need to demand better rights to hold their governments to account on behalf of citizens and to influence their EU decision making. And I think this is key if we want to expose, challenge and counter the corporate lobby influence on member states at their council, and if we want to really reinforce public interest decision making in the council.
Thank you, Vicky. Before giving citizens the floor, I would like to follow up with one question. As far as I know, you have launched in Corporate Europe Observatory, and also you personally, a whole lot of access to document requests, and of course there is a proceeding for this. So you ask for the document, then it may get some, or you don't get it, or you get some of that blackened, and then you can launch a complaint with the council. And if this is then accepted, you get some more, or you can go to court. Can you give us a bit more of your experience, also to inform Harald of what his steps might be?
Well, we haven't gone as far as to take this issue to court yet, but I do think that is for us something that is very much on the agenda. I mean, I could talk about a recent example we've had on a different tax transparency file. This is on the digital services tax. This is still going through the council. We've had, I think the council identified as I think about maybe 40 or 50 documents. We had half of them, perhaps. Great. They didn't tell us loads, but we had half of the documents, but we haven't had the other half of the documents. And crucially, we haven't had the documents which would give us more insight into how different member states are positioned. And I was looking through some of the arguments that were made. We were told that if they were to be released, they would diminish the chance of agreement at the council level. But crucially, and I love this bit, it says it would create additional pressure from stakeholders. So if we release this information to you, it will just encourage those lobbyists. Well, that is exactly my point, that at the moment the lobbying is happening on a digital services tax. Google and others are active on a digital services tax, but when it is all hidden actually it's only the corporate lobbies that are really active on this issue. And actually, if there was openness, then at least there would be a, how can I say, a level playing field so that others could participate as well. So we have a confirmatory application in on this particular case right now. Let's see how the council responds, and then we will take it from there. But I mean, for anyone listening, if for whichever EU institution you have, if you put in an access to documents request, if you don't get what you asked for first time, always appeal. I never know the precise success rate of an appeal, but I would say maybe 50% of the time you will get more at appeal than you do initially. So always put in an appeal.
Thank you, Vicky. So, and now I start with some of the written questions. I can only encourage everyone to vote on the written questions so that the best ones get listed upwards. So Johannes Priesemann asked the following: why did the German government block the taxation legislation for multinational companies? Dear Harald, as you are renamed today. Dear Harald, bitte.
Yes. Well, of course, I cannot see in the brain of Mr. Altmaier and his predecessors who were from the Social Democrats, but it is easy to understand that there are a lot of powerful transnational companies based in Germany. So they are quite well organized. They have a very strong lobby among both coalition partners in the government. And one organization is particularly active here. It's called the Stiftung Familien. This is seemingly a representative of small and medium family-owned enterprises, but it is not. Actually, it's a coalition of, I would call them the German oligarchs, Oetker, Haniel, Lidl, and big transnational corporations owned by not in the general stock exchange but by private ownership. Yeah, these are represented by the Stiftung Familien, and they have ordered a study, and they have claimed that this would put us in disadvantage in international competition and so on. And as it happens often in Germany, when the big ones complain about a certain policy, then in most cases, the economics ministers who are responsible for this legislation follow their demands, and this is what happened here. The claim they do is that this would give them disadvantages in international competition is really not valid. The law would be applied to every company with more than 750 million euros turnover inside the European Union, independent of where the headquarters is based. And regarding business secrets, the European Parliament has already passed an amendment which would allow the companies to postpone the publication of data which could be dealt with as business secrets, giving them disadvantages if it would be published. So there are no real reasons. They just don't want to be put under pressure from the public when they hide their duty to pay taxes. It's as simple as that, and the German ministers play with them. And the Social Democrats have only very recently changed their mind because they had an inside party campaign for the party leadership, and then the left wing put pressure on them, and then Mr. Scholz also said, okay, now I'm in favor. This is how it happened. So the German coalition is splitted, but unfortunately, to be split means they do an abstention on the legislation level, and abstention in the council has the same value as a no. Yeah, because for a qualified majority, you need this 2/3 of the votes. So if a vote is not on the positive side, it's on the negative side. Abstention does not diminish the quorum. So de facto, the Germans vote no. Officially, they vote abstention. Sorry.
Vicky, I have lots of questions. So important additions, yes. And please, everybody, as short as possible. Please, yeah. Vicky.
So just to add to that, I think the German government abdication of responsibility on this tax transparency file is even worse perhaps than Harald said, because Germany can maintain its abstention fine at the council level, but what it has failed to do even now is recognise that amongst the other member states there is now a qualified majority for that file, but they have abdicated their presidential duties by failing to put it on the agenda at the council level, to give it the chance for a vote, to get the qualified majority and to push it through for trilogue, because of, as Harald said, these internal coalition disagreements with Altmaier acting as a bloc. And that, I think, is absolutely disgraceful, particularly because Campact and others in Germany have been running a campaign action on this issue. 227,000 citizens from across the EU have demanded Germany put it on the agenda. You don't have to vote for it, but put it on the agenda, and they have refused. Outrageous.
Yeah. Look, okay, I'm moving on. I can only say, unfortunately, the Portuguese presidency has not yet decided to prioritize the file. And we have just written to the Portuguese government to put this in their presidential program, but there seems to be strong hesitation. And what we see is, and that is what Harald fully correctly explained, there is a big problem that even although there is qualified majority voting, when it comes to things which are sensitive to some member states, they tend not to do it. And that is the reason behind this. And they have not yet arrived at majority democracy to the full. So next question is, can someone not start a legal proceeding against these practices of the council? So, Harald, have you already employed your lawyer?
Actually, we are really considering this, and we will construct a model case. Vicky has already one, so I suppose you will go sooner or later to court. But we will do our own, and really encourage others to do the same. And I really, in this context, recommend to read the reasons of the judgment the European Court of Justice take 2 years ago, when it were about the Council's position in the trilogue. The Court of Justice has decided that the Council's position in the trilogue have to be made public even when the negotiations are still underway. Actually, this is a dark shadow on the good image of the Parliament. The Parliament's bureaucracy, the Parliament's secretariat still refuses to follow this court judgment. But what I really recommend is that to read the reasons for this court judgment of 2008, because it's even clearer of what Mrs. O'Reilly or what the national parliamentarian said. The European courts say in a very clear words that either the council's the council's internal procedures are made public, or the citizens have reasons to doubt the legitimacy of the whole legislative process. These reasons for the judgment, they read like a leaflet of Transparency International. And if these are the convictions of the judges, I think there are good chances to win this process, this struggle for transparency in the council. We can win it in Luxembourg in the court.
The problem is, only to respond, is also from an institutional perspective. The Parliament has often voted for transparency, in particular in the council. It is true that there are some areas where the Parliament doesn't practice what it preaches. When it comes to the trilogues, Harald, you're typing again, sorry about this. I might sponsor you a new keyboard, but probably you will not accept because of independence issues. However, the point here is the Parliament is giving documents about ongoing trilogues to the public, but only on individual requests. The demand to put this on a website is ignored by the parliament leadership. I, at some point, started a competition, so to coordinate citizens to ask these questions about all ongoing trilogues, and then some of that was published, but still there is this refusal. The council, however, publishes more or less nothing on no stage towards the decision making, which would reveal which member state takes which position. So now the parliament voted often that this is not acceptable. The ombudswoman said this is not acceptable. Now the problem is the parliament cannot go to court, because the parliament needs a majority in plenary to go to court, while the German Bundestag, one individual fraction would go to court and we will change the situation. Here in the parliament, it needs a plenary majority, and this is very hard to get because the governments refusing on the level of the council are the same political parties which are also in the European Parliament. So therefore it's very hard to get a majority for such a move, and therefore the Parliament cannot go effectively cannot go to court. Therefore we can only create case law by as many people as possible complaining in the court against refusal of access to information. Probably the council will agree with these citizens. However, this does not change the working method. You only get then a special document, and the council may well continue with their method of proceeding. So, but it will create, of course, a permanent pressure if your working methods are seen by the highest court in Europe as not legitimate. And therefore, I can only invite everyone to create more case law so that the rules of procedure will change. And there's a very great tool, and I would like to ask staff to put a link to it. It's called Ask EU. It's an NGO running a public platform. In Germany, we have Frag den Staat, which is basically a public space for asking for access to information, and the response of the council or commission will be documented there so that you create also public debate over refusal of access to documents. But however, it's critical to go for a complaint and then to go to court and do it as often as possible. And that is, I think, the only way how to bring about change. And yeah, so the question about the legal proceedings was I tried to answer. Yes. So there's one question to mainly Vicky, I think. What chances and ways do you see to install public lobbying registers on national and European level?
So, of course, we have the EU lobby register at the moment. It is currently being reviewed. At the moment, it covers the Commission and the Parliament, and the Council is outside of it, but it is in the negotiations at the moment with a view to perhaps joining. If it does join, it's clear that it will be at a very limited level, and it will not, I think, cover the kind of discussions that we are talking about today, the kind of officials that we are talking about today, because where I would really like to see lobby transparency is in the officials who are participating in these working parties, and then the lobbying that they are receiving. And I think it is very unlikely that an EU level lobby register would cover that kind of detail, because we are talking about national officials and national ministers, but national officials operating at the EU level. So even if the Council joins the EU lobby register, I think it is unlikely it will have that kind of coverage. So that then does take us to national lobby registers. And the picture there is really, really mixed. Some countries have effective registers, one or two, and then there are many that do not. The UK's register is terrible. and it has a very limited definition of lobbying. If I look at the Irish register, that is interesting, because at least the permanent representative in Brussels from Ireland and the deputy are covered by that register, and indeed are MEPs, Irish MEPs. It's not perfect, and the officials that I was talking about, the lower level officials in the permanent representation, I don't think they are covered, but some are at the highest level. So that is an opportunity. But I think this will always be a bit tricky, because lobbying in the council around member state positioning will always fall, or I'm concerned will always fall between the two levels. And so really getting coverage there is going to be tricky. So then we have to look at proactive lobby transparency, and governments proactively putting out there the meetings that they have. There has been some progress made on that at the EU level. So now, particularly when a country is about to take on the presidency of the council, they will start to publish lists of lobby meetings held by the permanent representative and the deputy. But again, what we miss always is who is lobbying at the official level, because I think officials play a really key role here. They are the ones doing the negotiation. They are the ones who have the real policy knowledge. And quite frankly, if I would want to have influence on a particular dossier, I wouldn't go to the perm rep. I would go to the policy officer who is in the meetings, and they at the moment are not covered really by any transparency, either imposed at the EU level or at the national level or proactively, and that is a real gap in our understanding.
Harald, you wanted to come in.
Yes, there are several questions in the chat about the role of national parliaments, and Vicky has already mentioned it. Whoa. Sorry for the noise behind. There's an alarm going on the road here. Can you still hear me?
Yes, it's only Berlin, noisy and loud. Yeah, please.
Okay, we have done a survey about what the rights of the national parliaments are and how they use it. And unfortunately, the major result is many European parliaments have many strong national rights to hold their governments to account what they do in Brussels, but very few parliamentarians actually make use of these rights. This is a major issue, in particular in Germany. You know, the Germans have the same rights as the Swedish or the Danish or the Dutch. They use it. But I found out in the current legislative period, the Bundestag has exactly once took the right to put a mandate to tell the government which position to defend in Brussels, and this was about the negotiations on the Brexit. But for all other issues, there is never a majority in the German Bundestag really to decide a mandate and to say to the government, please do that and this, and report to us how you have achieved this, or if you have not achieved this, justify why. And I talked to members of the responsible committee, and the major reason is they say, we are near to the government, we know what they do anyway, we control them, don't worry, but this doesn't need to be discussed in public. And the issue with the national parliamentarians is that they share the view, the perspective of their national governments, that European Union legislation is sort of a foreign policy, yeah? Where the parliament has not to meddle with the government. This is a view, a perspective which many national parliamentarians share, even in those countries who are very keen and transparent, for example, the Dutch or the Swedish one. When you look deeper how these parliaments care about European issues, you find out that they are mainly concerned with whether the subsidiarity issue is fulfilled. Yeah, whether the EU, whether the Commission does form of power grabbing and takes on business which is not their competence and so on. But in many cases, they do not really care about the substance of the legislative proposals. Yeah, and this makes it possible that the national governments play this game as if European legislation would be foreign policy. And the other question was, did you try to ask the German government about the national positions of other governments in the council? Yes, of course we did. And we did it in the case which Vicky has been the first to promote and make it public. We asked them, how do the council discuss the transparency question among the council members? Yeah? And the interesting thing is, they send us 270 pages of files, but they blackened all parts which had to do with the national government positions. And so it looked like this, yeah? Freedom of information meant that it's all blackened out. And the interesting thing is, we did the same in Sweden. You know, Sweden, famous country of transparency, every government file is accessible and so on. In Sweden, they did exactly the same. And I have to say, the major problem is that the national parliaments, at least the majority in the national parliaments, they share this practice. They don't break it. Yeah, they think it's okay that the government does it, so they do not really complain. And this makes it really a major problem. National politicians seek only national legitimation, and for them, European issues are boring. They cannot win additional votes, so they don't care.
Thank you. So I would like now to give the floor to a few who have been waiting, raising their hands. As I said, if you speak, please, if you speak for an institution, please tell us for whom. I start with Marianne Fricke. Bitte schön.
That was a mistake. I didn't want to ask anything.
That's a pity. I continue. I wish you a good day. Emmanuel Rebasti. Hi, you can speak. Okay, I'll continue. Christian Sterzing, you need a long time of endurance to...
He's on mute, I think.
Yes, so far you have to unmute Christian.
Yeah, jetzt.
No, I didn't want to ask questions. Sorry, somehow it's the wrong information.
Okay, put down your hand, Emmanuel, and now Christian.
Mikko.
Okay, so I'll go on. I won't let myself being frustrated by this trial to increase participation. Uta Lentföratien. This is, please, Uta. So this time people want to write, not speak, for whatever reasons. The technology works, but Uli Seeg. You have to switch on your microphone if you really want to speak. Probably too many people have just tried this hand thing. So now I'm switching on everyone who wanted to speak originally. So you have now the opportunity to unmute. Wolfgang Firmenich, bitte. Okay, so this is a rather frustrating experience of participation. So I continue with the written questions, and there are some. And while let us talk again about the role of the national parliaments, because this seems to me crucial. First of all, Harald, I normally agree with you, but your sympathetic view of the second chamber in Germany is totally against my everyday life experience. First, the inequality of the voting is even more extreme in a certain way. Why does the funny Saarland have 3 votes and North Rhine-Westphalia only 6? So while the inhabitants is incredibly extreme, and there are differences, but there are also things which are worse at the Bundesrat than in the council. So for instance, in the council, the voting is recorded, while in the Bundesrat it is not even the voting. So therefore, Harald, when do you start working on the Bundesrat rather than defending it? This would be my, and I find that really strange that in Germany we have the same logic on the second chamber, and that is really not a European issue, this intransparency. It is typical for certain of non-parliamentary forms of federalism. The United States has a Senate. We have a council in Europe, and this is something which we have to change. But in the meanwhile, of course, these rules can be improved, and they have to be improved. But we should not think that these problems do not exist in other federal constructions, and it's and then secondly, when it comes to the national parliamentarians, this creates also an absurd situation. There's a database called EUDOCS, in which you can find for the German parliament all the information, where you also find which member state positioned itself how. Although the quality of these documents is not the same for all proceedings, more or less you find the information. This leads now to the following situation. Very regularly, these minutes, the members of parliament have access to also on the European level, but only those members of parliament who have the right connections. So, for instance, we are negotiating in the European Parliament, and some around the table know what's happening in council and others don't, depending on their nationality. The same is with the lobbyists. Some lobbyists know what's happening in council, others don't. So while we are all equal in the parliament, as well as between stakeholders, this non-public access to information creates lawmakers and citizens and stakeholders of 2 classes, of those who are informed and those who are not. And this is partly a question of power, but also a question from which member state you are, how networked you are. And this is why this is a situation which is cannot endure. I have to say the Netherlands, though, they are moving very regular to parliamentary decisions on mandates to the government. There's a huge change. While I agree with you that the Scandinavians, they have very strong traditions of transparency, they are more careful to bind their national governments because, of course, if you put binding mandates, this limits the possibility for compromise making in the council. So these are some remarks from my side on some of the discussions put, and of course you can also comment in the next round. Then I'm just checking what else is here. So this week we covered a lot of ground. So and there is some issues of specific nature, which is not so much on the processes. I read one comment, agiris passas. The practice of governments in the Council is somehow understandable. What is unacceptable is why the European Parliament is dragged in those diplomatic practices that the Council imposes, trilogues, early agreements, and the like, abandoning all principles of parliamentary democracy like transparency, openness in legislation. So this is something I will certainly comment later, but also for you, how you see this. So do you think the Council is more justified in doing this than the Parliament? Yes, so there again, the trilogue. I think I covered this already. So whether the trilogue is a black box or not, it's put in German, I summarized. And whether the Parliament is also in this non-transparency. I said that before, that we are half, but not full. Yes, then there is the note that one of the long-running examples in Council of a blocked file is the important proposal for a directive on implementing the principle of equal treatment between persons irrespective of religion or belief, disability, age, or sexual orientation. And this is actually blocked since 2008. So 12 years of refusal to grant additional equal opportunities for those in difficulty. Then some people want your graph, Harald. Can you share it here? You can upload it on the chat if you like. So I think we covered a lot of ground now. I give now the floor to Mona. She has just put up her hand. Perhaps she wants to speak, and then we should wrap up. Mona.
Yes, thank you. I can't use my video, but you can hear me, right?
Yes, excellent.
So my name is Mona Aranea. I work at the German Hans Böckler Stiftung in Düsseldorf, which is a German trade union think tank. And I've taken up the position here recently. So before I worked in actually research on corporate lobbying in Brussels as a research associate at Cardiff Business School in the UK. And when I did this research on corporate lobby groups in Brussels, my focus was employer lobbying. So lobbying on issues of work and employment. And so I have two questions. One question is, I realized in discussions or friendly chats with friends and colleagues at Lobby Control in Cologne that the whole policy area of work and employment is not really in the focus of advocacy groups who are critical of lobbying and of corporate lobbying, and who rightly investigate the whole problem of corporate capture in the EU. And I'm wondering why there's such a blank spot, because obviously in Europe we currently have an integrated labor market where everyone can work wherever we want, but we have fairly little control over our work and employment conditions. So isn't there a big problem of multinational corporate interests that are favoring this kind of Wild West labor market, and that is basically eroding the European Union as a project of social peace and international peace? I have also another question that is related to the transparency register, a very practical question. I realize that some corporate actors do not put the correct information into that lobbying register, especially when it comes to their Brussels office. I realized, for example, that the big lobbying group Eurocommerce, representing the commerce and retail sector, shares offices in Brussels with several German multinationals like Schwarz Group, Aldi, Lidl, Metro, those big German retailers. But these big German retailers, when you look at their lobbying register entry, do not put down this Brussels address. They put down another address, or they claim they don't have a Brussels address. So there's a specific kind of corporate capture that is manifested in their Brussels office shared with a lobbying group that's supposed to represent interests from across the EU. and this isn't reflected in their lobbying register entry. So my question there is, do lobby groups like CEO or Investigate Europe, do you look specifically into corporate lobbying register entries and check whether these big corporations actually put down the right information? Is there any research going on? Because this is obviously very interesting for research.
Thank you.
Like myself. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, vielen Dank nach Düsseldorf. Thanks a lot. So I would suggest that we wrap up. I would give and include, of course, the recent remarks and questions. So Vicky, perhaps you, and then.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And thanks to Mona for the good questions. I mean, I think you are right. Your first question about labour standards, work and employment issues, I think they really are undercovered by civil society. I guess maybe we have this view that the trade unions will handle that, but I absolutely recognise that that's not enough, and that civil society should be working with trade unions on this issue. So you're right to reflect upon that, and perhaps it goes back to the point I made earlier on about the disadvantages that our sectors have when it comes to capacity and resources to be able to track all the issues that multinationals are interested in, but it's a fair point. On the lobby register, I won't get into specifics, but I absolutely agree with you that there is a problem with the lobby register, and it comes back to the fact that fundamentally it is a voluntary register. It is not tied into EU law. It is essentially a voluntary register, that therefore that seriously affects the quality of the data that some organisations submit to it. And we see issues of both underreporting and over-reporting when it comes to financial figures in the lobby register. It's one of the reasons why Corporate Europe Observatory, together with Lobby Control, who you also mentioned, our colleagues in Germany, have set up this database called LobbyFacts, which takes the EU lobby data and presents it in a different way, and by using some of the tools on the website, you can start to explore and expose some of the dodgy data that is in the register. Another tip is, if you are concerned that an organisation with a Brussels office might be underreporting, you can also check their figures at the National Bank of Belgium, the budget, the annual budget or annual accounts that they declare. And if you were to find a mismatch there, that might give you some clues as to perhaps an indication of under-reporting. There's not enough time to explain that procedure here, but I'd be happy to talk to anyone that was interested in that afterwards. But I entirely agree with you, there's an issue of under-reporting. This is probably my last chance to comment, so I'd really like to say thanks for the webinar. These issues are so important, and it's really great to be able to discuss them with you. I'm going to leave you with just one final example of the lack of transparency of the Council, and it's not on a legislative file. It's on how the Council itself runs itself, and people that are in the Brussels bubble and elsewhere may be familiar with the fact that some presidencies choose to take corporate sponsorship for their 6 months in office, and Germany didn't do this, but beforehand there's been a long history of this happening. Microsoft, car companies, oil companies, even all sponsoring in some way that has always been very unclear EU presidencies. Absolutely outrageous. And the Ombudswoman Emily O'Reilly did a report on this earlier this year, and it's really shocking. But we can't, the lack of transparency in the Council is such that we can't even see the decision making on this issue. It's not legislative, but presumably it's very embarrassing. But the Council member states are using the lack of transparency in the Council to undermine a very limited response to public concern about council sponsorship. The council is not proposing that this practice be banned. They're just asking that it should be made transparent. And even on that issue, member states are saying, oh no, that's too much, it's interfering with our decision making, and they are keeping those papers pretty much hidden so that we don't know which member states are saying, are taking which positions. We have a good idea about some of them, but not all of them. And that for me just absolutely tells the story of what the problem is in the council. So please do take the actions that Sven and others have been talking about today. Use Ask the EU, put in your access request, challenge this, and I hope that together with MPs, particularly at the national level, and other activists, we can start to see some change.
Harald, please.
Yeah, there were a lot of questions. I just try to make it short. Regarding the workers' rights and the whole social dimension of the EU, I share the impression that civil society could be more active there. It has a little bit to do also with how efficiently the European trade union organizations work. But of course, there is much further work to be done. To excuse ourselves, we as Investigate Europe, we have done a big report about the deliberate precarization of European labor markets and the role the Council and the Commission have played here, in particular during the Euro crisis. And we have done a large report about the exploitation of traffic drivers on European highways and so on. So we are at least aware that there are a lot of issues, but there are also important legislative files which inside of our Council project we are going to follow. For example, now the discussion about the minimum wage directive. This is an important issue here in this context, and I share your view. This should be dealt with more intensively. Then there was the question about this long pending directive, non-discrimination directive. The major issue here is the non-discrimination directive is based on a paragraph which needs unanimity in the Council. So it cannot be decided by a qualified majority, but it needs to be decided by all member states. And of course, as you know, there are governments in the European Union who have made the discrimination against gay and lesbians has made it official government policy. So they will always veto this directive, I assume. So for the time being, I think there is no chance, even with maximum transparency in the Council, there's no chance to get this directive passed there. One last word on the Bundesrat, Sven. No, I won't work on the Bundesrat quite soon because I'm engaged with Investigate Europe. We do European issues. But I very closely follow the work of my colleague Albert Funk, who is covering the Bundesrat. And what I see there, yes, of course, on the first hand, or on first view, you might think that it is the same problem. But there is a major difference. And the difference is, at least from a journalistic point of view, it's relatively easy to find out what happens in the Bundesrat. It's much easier to call the German Länder governments and Länder parliaments than to call in 27 member states. You know, from a single journalist's point of view, it's much easier to do research about Bundesrat and its procedures in there than to actually in the Council. So I think the comparison really stops when it comes to 27 governments in different countries with completely different languages, which most languages I do not speak, so I have no chance to call there. And even with our team, we are only present in 9 countries, but not in 27, because nobody will fund this kind of network. So, yeah, I think for the Council, we have to demand much higher levels of transparency. Then of course, it would be nice to have it in the Bundesrat, but from a journalistic point of view, the Bundesrat is researchable.
Okay, I'm really tempted to go on with this German debate, but I prefer to do this at a certain moment with a glass of red wine with you. But I have to say I'm not equally optimistic when it comes to this. However, I think this was a really interesting and timely discussion. Also, in most recent examples, the Council is annoying me with refusals of access to documents. I can only summarize that actually the Parliament in this regard has less rights than individual citizens. Unfortunately, also in intergovernmental agreements, the Parliament accepted to be treated worse than individual individual citizens in Europe. Therefore, it is so important to build case law on the matter, which also put then pressure first on Parliament to act and put additional pressure, and lastly, to have really these procedures challenged. We have also seen that even if the Ombudswoman has done a strategic report on the methods of the Council, she has been very open in the past also to respond to citizens' complaints on specific cases. So therefore, I can only introduce and welcome if all the legal possibilities are used. So filing access to document requests, complaining, the complaint mechanism, going to the court and to the Ombudswoman and raise public attention over this outdated working method. So I can understand if governments which were until recently at war with each other have difficulties being transparent about decision making. But the European Union is at another stage. We are at a stage that citizens have a right to hold their governments accountable what they do. And this is the case in Parliament. One of the questions raised the issue of trilogues. One could, of course, say, like many in civil society did, why does the Parliament bother at all to go to trilogues and doesn't follow the ordinary legislative procedure? The reason is simple. The rights of the European Parliament are stronger in a trilogue proceeding than in a first and second agreement, reading agreement. And this is why the Parliament is transparent when it comes to its own proceedings, but when it comes to entering the stage with the Council, then a space of intransparency opens. The alternative for the Parliament is to refuse trilogues and only go through the first and second reading agreements, but then we need always to overcome a veto of the Council, an absolute majority in plenary. And this is very hard to find. And I can only tell you that a lot of the progressive victories in Parliament would have never been possible outside of the trilogue, not because it's intransparent, but because it doesn't require an absolute majority in plenary. And this is a fault of the Lisbon Treaty. There are many faults in the Lisbon Treaty, by the way, and this is a major issue for next year's Conference of Europe. And in the long run, we need to build something like a European Republic with a true second chamber rather than an intransparent council. Lastly, I would like to say a word on trade unions. Mona, I would like to get in touch with you, and I speak very openly on this. I think that the core of the problem is, why don't we have full support on labor issues? It's very simple. Trade unions are themselves seeing themselves as an effective lobby, and they are. They have still a very strong role to play. So if you look on the German level, the trade union movement was not a strong supporter of a lobby register or of a legislative footprint. And on the European level, the European Alliance, Alter EU, which is bringing together 123 member organizations, of which Vicky Cann's CEO is one, has very few trade union members. There is a good example from Austria, the Arbeiterkammer, which has been very active on this, but the German unions, I have to say, were not overly active, and they are not members of the alliance. And this is not by chance. And I can only say, I believe that the more globalization we have, the more we need to build transnational democracy. And on a transnational level, the cozy relationships between the social partners and the governments are not holding. And therefore, on this level, we really need to join all progressive forces for transparency and lobby transparency. And therefore, if there is, for instance, the Böckler Stiftung thinking in a similar direction, I can only invite you, join that struggle for more accountability and transparency in European institutions and on the national level, at least when acting on a European level. And that is very important. I can only say, I can promise I will continue in this struggle. My colleague Daniel Freund, who was formerly active on transparency issues for Transparency International, is now a member of the European Parliament. He took my seat in the AFCO committee, so the responsible committee for constitutional affairs. So we will continue and let's join forces as we did in the past. And I thank for all the interest here and wish you great follow-up articles. What you published today in Portugal, that Portugal was helping on the rule of law blockade, is already a breaking news, I would say. It deserves such news. We need much more, because I'm sure lots of progressive hands would have been much further if we had strong transparency and accountability. And this is not a left and right issue. It is in the end an issue of democratic convictions and principles as they are foreseen in our founding treaties. I wish you well. Thank you for the participation. Keep up the good work. Bye-bye, everybody. And the next Europe Calling will, and I'm sure Harald will love it, will be in cooperation with MEPs from the national level, from the Liberals, from the Greens and the left, on the failure of BaFin when it comes to money laundering in Germany. And I'm looking forward to this webinar next week. All the best, and I'll try to keep citizens connected to what's happening on the European stage. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.